name's Darren, and welcome to the Maker's Rage podcast and the new series 5.5 Great Things. Someone gave me a bit of feedback suggesting that lists are always popular, and I didn't want to just do a top 10, which is kind of cliche. Everyone does top 10s or even top 5s. So it says 5.5 great things, the half being one not so great thing, or perhaps a humorous or disreputable thing associated with a particular topic or person or idea or place. In this case, the Olympics, which has just ended. At the time of recording, the closing ceremony was yesterday, but I already miss it, so I'm going to do a 5.5 great things about the Olympics, although I probably should have done it before it started. I guess I forgot how much I appreciated them. So for me, the very first great thing is, in fact, the very first Olympic Games, traditionally thought to be in 776 BCE. Probably not exactly that year, but certainly sometime in the 8th century BCE. Note, this wasn't when the first Olympic flame was lit. That wasn't until the Olympics in Amsterdam in 1928. But I don't think it's any coincidence that the first Olympics was happening at exactly the time that the Iliad and the Odyssey were supposed to have been written, when, if not the Olympic flame, the flame of civilization was beginning to kindle again, after the long period of darkness that followed the Bronze Age collapse. The first Olympics consisted of just a single sporting event that happened to occur at the same time as a religious ceremony at the city of Olympia to celebrate Zeus. It was just a foot race, or a sprint, called a stadion, which is around 200 meters, and the first winner was supposedly a cook from the city of Elis called Corybus. And why a foot race? Perhaps, if you were the fastest man in Greece, you were thought to most closely resemble that great hero who was known by the epithet fleet-footed, Achilles. And in fact, it wasn't until the 14th Olympiad in 724 BC that a second event was added, the Diaulos, which just consisted of 2 stadions, so adding a bit of endurance to the challenge. There was no marathon at this stage, of course. The Battle of Marathon wouldn't occur for several hundred years, but there was a race added in 714 BCE that might have resembled it somewhat, called the Dolichos, which was a race of 24 stadions. I suppose eventually the Greeks thought to add a bit of variety with all this foot racing, so they added the hoplitodromos, a race of 2 stadions all wearing a helmet and shield. I'd love to see that reintroduced. There was also the emergence of the pygmachia, the forerunner of boxing. And indeed this was a boxing match that lasted until knockout or submission. There were no breaks, no gloves, no corner men, and the boxers wore not gloves but leather straps that readily caused cuts. Soon after, an even more popular event was introduced called the pancration, which resembled a UFC bout but with fewer rules. You could strangle, choke, kick, break bones. Only no biting and no gouging was allowed. It's interesting to note here the Greek word for contest is agon, which is cognate with the word agony. It's no wonder the pancration became the single most popular event at the Olympics, well, except perhaps for the chariot race. Maybe prestigious is a better word than popular, although it was popular, but only the wealthy could compete, in the sense that only the wealthy could afford a biga or quadriga, a chariot of 2 or 4 horses, and send a slave to race them. Of course, whoever owned the horses took the credit, though they might have had the athleticism of Jabba the Hutt. Eventually other games were added to occur in between each Olympics, the Greeks, like us, being impatient to wait 4 years. The Isthmian Games, in honour of Poseidon. The Nemean Games, also in honour of Zeus, but at the temple of Nemea in Argolis. And the Pythian Games, in honour of Apollo, which included artistic events, mainly musical, Apollo being, of course, the chief of the Muses. Together these were called the Panhellenic Games, and in fact, It was a wrestler called Milo of Croton who was the first to earn the prestigious title of Periodonikes, or the winner of all Panhellenic games during the same Olympiad. Such was the glory that was Greece. The games persisted even after the Roman conquest, and indeed the Emperor Nero wanted to be a Periodonikes himself as a charioteer, and despite falling out of the chariot in one of the races, and not even finishing, declared himself winner and Periodonikes for that Olympiad. The record was eventually corrected after he was assassinated. Anyway, eventually Christianity came along and spoiled the party, and the Emperor Theodosius I banned it as a pagan practice in 394 AD, after more than 1,000 years of uninterrupted Olympiads. Eventually, the site of Olympia was abandoned, looted, and the temple and the famous statue of Zeus, carved by Phidias and one of the 7 wonders of the world, would be destroyed by earthquakes and buried in the surrounding landscape, and all evidence of their existence lost, until 1766, when an archaeologist, Richard Chandler, rediscovered it in Greece, now a colony of the Ottoman Empire. And after Greek independence, extensive excavations eventually revive an interest in the Olympic Games later in the 19th century, and so it would have a second beginning in 1896, not as a religious festival, but a secular one, spearheaded by Pierre de Coubertin, who establishes the IOC in preparation for the inaugural Games in Athens, for which the Panhellenic stadium, which dates back to the 4th century BCE, was completely renovated. And I suppose remembering that the Greek word for contest is agon, writes in the Olympic Creed, quote, "The most important thing in the Olympic Games is not to win, but to take part, just as the most important thing in life is not the triumph, but the struggle. The essential thing is not to have conquered, but to have fought well." Great thing about the Olympics number 2. The Olympic truce, or ekikairia. Before each competition, emissaries were sent out from the city of Olympia to Greek cities in the whole Greek world, or Magna Graecia, cities that were scattered across the Mediterranean basin, from the Black Sea and Asia Minor to North Africa, Italy, and southern France, and these emissaries would announce the exact date of the next Olympic Games, and a sacred truce is then announced, called the 3-month Truce of Zeus, and this was in fact enforced by the Spartans, so maybe why it was never violated. An interesting aside here, the Spartans never competed in the boxing or pygmachia, because victory was only by submission. If a Spartan boxer was bettered, the shame of submitting was so great, most would rather die. And yet you can see that while the agon, or sporting contest, isn't a solution to warfare, it sublimates our more violent tendencies. If Clausewitz said, "War is politics by other means," then the Games could be thought of as war by other means. It was always understood that warfare would resume right afterwards though, and the hoplitodromos, or hoplite foot race, occurring near the end of the ancient Games, was a pointer to this. The modern Games have never been an occasion to enforce a truce. In fact, in the 2 world wars, it was the Olympics that was suspended, which is fine for a secular Games, but notably something the ancient Olympians would have considered sacrilege. Number 3, the pentathlon. And in fact, I'm going to throw in the modern heptathlon and decathlon in here, because although decathletes and heptathletes and triathletes aren't as celebrated in the modern Games, the ancients considered these all-round athletes to be the greatest, because though inferior to specialized athletes in individual events, they were considered superior in overall development. The ancient pentathlon consisted of 5 events: running, or stadion of course, jumping, discus, javelin and wrestling. and the Greeks being obsessed with balance and proportion in body or harmonia and mind or temperament, sophrosyne, it's no wonder the pentathletes were the ones who were chosen as models for sculpture, especially when chiselling the bodies of the gods. The discus thrower by Myron, the spear bearer by Polycletus, and the Artemisian bronze depicting Zeus throwing a thunderbolt, all may have been modelled on famed pentathletes. The fourth great thing, marathon, meaning the race, the battle, and the little town in Greece, after which both are named, conflating the ancient accounts of Herodotus, Lucian, and Plutarch among others. The story goes that in 490 BC, during the first Persian invasion of Greece, the Athenians won a famed victory near the Bay of Marathon, despite being vastly outnumbered, and they sent their greatest runner, Phidippides, to run the 25 miles back to Athens, barefoot and over mountainous terrain, to announce the victory. In Attic Greek, Nenikekiman, we are victorious. And then he died of exhaustion. In fact, according to Herodotus, Phidippides was sent not to Athens, 25 miles away, to announce a victory, but 140 miles away to Sparta, before the battle had even begun, to beg them for help. But as usual, the Spartans used the fact there was a holy festival on as an excuse not to commit, so the Athenians won a great victory without their aid. But after the hoplites won the ground battle, they saw that the Persian triremes were heading to Athens to outflank them, so the whole Athenian army marched the 40 kilometers or 25 miles back to Athens at a savage pace, considering they were in full armor. Reminds you of the hoplitodromos. And arriving back in the late afternoon, the Persian ships realized they'd failed and turned away, thus completing the Athenian victory. So Phidippides didn't run 25 miles and die of exhaustion. He ran 140 miles and arrived in Sparta the next day, and apparently was perfectly fine. But you can see why we've traditionally preferred the legendary version, as did Michel Braille and Pierre de Coubertin, who wanted to commemorate the event. In the first modern Olympic Games in 1896, 25 men entered this first marathon foot race, 21 of them Greek, and in a little under 3 hours, the lead runner was in sight of the newly restored Panhellenic stadium. And when the crowd there realized it was in fact a Greek, 80,000 voices said one word repeatedly, Neni Kekiman, we are victorious. That runner was Spiridon Luis, a Greek water carrier, who gave Greece in fact their only track and field victory during that Olympics. Funny aside, in 1912 a Japanese runner named Shizo Kanakuri didn't finish the race, but stopped by a house looking for a drink and rest, and in fact fell asleep, and the next day discreetly returned to Japan without telling anyone. He eventually returned in 1967 to finish his marathon in 54 years, 8 months, 6 days, 5 hours, 32 minutes and 20.3 seconds. I love the 0.3. By contrast, in 1960, the Ethiopian Sabibi Bakila was the first and only marathon runner to emulate the legendary Phidippides by completing the race, and in fact winning it, barefoot. The fifth and last great thing, the olive wreath, or katainos, not to be confused with the laurel wreath, which was associated with Apollo, and was awarded more for academic or artistic accomplishment. Consider the idea of the poet laureate, and in Italy, laureato refers to any student who's graduated. The olive wreath awarded to Olympians was taken from an olive tree that grew at the city of Olympia, and its branches were cut with a pair of golden scissors by Apelles Amphitales, or a boy whose parents were both living, and these were placed on a golden ivory table. From there, the Hellanodicae, or the judges of the Olympic Games, would take them, make the wreaths and crown the winners of the Games. Note, there was no podium, No gold, silver or bronze medals. The wreath crowned only the victors, while the losers, according to the poet Pindar, went back to their home cities, quote, back to their mothers with no delight, creeping through narrow alleys. That said, if you won, you were feted like a god on return to your home city, where statues were erected in your honour, more durable, indeed, than the perishable olive wreath with which you were crowned at Olympia. And it's important to remember there was no tangible afterlife in Greek religion. Hades wasn't an enviable place to end up, so glory was only achievable in this life. Again, the ancient historian Herodotus recounts a story that's relevant to this peculiar Greek worldview. While interrogating some Arcadians, the Persian emperor Xerxes asked them why only a few hundred Spartans were defending the pass of Thermopylae. And they said, all the other men are participating in the Olympic Games. And when he asked what was the prize that it would draw men away from defending their country, an olive wreath came the answer. Flabbergasted, one of his generals uttered, good heavens, Mardonius, what kind of men are these against whom you've brought us to fight? Men who do not compete for possessions, but for virtue. For Coubertin, in his modern Olympic creed, victory wasn't everything. Quote, the essential thing is not to have conquered, but to have fought well. That's all well and good, but the ancient Greeks would have disagreed. And yet, in the modern Olympics, some of the most memorable moments for us are of athletes not conquering, but fighting well. So that's the 5 great things about the Olympics. What have I chosen for the half, or not so great thing? I thought about drugs or cheating, the real reason the Russians aren't allowed to compete. I thought about the fact there were only men originally allowed to compete, or the highly contentious issue of gender in athletics. I thought about the several times the Olympics were boycotted, like the 1980 Moscow Olympics, boycotted by America and others because of the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan, and then in a tit-for-tat when the USSR boycotted the following Olympics in LA. Humorously, in 1988, North Korea and some of its rinky-dink allies boycotted the Seoul Olympics in South Korea because the North weren't allowed to co-host. But I decided to end on a humorous note by listing some of the weirder, crazy events that were once part of the Olympics. Of course, I've already mentioned a few in the ancient games, like the hoplitodromos, or a race in full armour, or the chariot race, which I think they should bring back, although members of PETA might protest at horses being whipped, or the pancration, for which there was only 2 rules, no biting and no gouging. And indeed there was one winner, Arakion, who died while being choked, but because his opponent was in the process of submitting, he was declared a winner posthumously. For the modern Olympics, in the 1900 Games in Paris, there was a hot air balloon race, covering 768 miles from Paris to Poland, which was then part of the Russian Empire. The winner, Henry de Laval, on landing was arrested by the Russian police. Another event at the same Olympics was live pigeon shooting, another one to rankle the PETA warriors. The winner was a Belgian named Leon Delun, who shot 21 pigeons. Altogether, in fact, 300 pigeons were killed apparently in that Olympics. With like hot air balloon racing, live pigeon shooting only appeared at the Olympics once. At the 1908 Games in London, tug of war was introduced as an event, and this appeared at 5 Olympic Games before being retired. But there is a significant lobby to bring it back, so who knows what the future holds. Also in 1908, pistol dueling was an event, in which competitors shot at each other with wax bullets. In the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, painting was introduced as a competition, as well as other events like sculpture, music, architecture, and literature. This is probably a nod to one of the Panhellenic Games, the Pythian Games in honour of Apollo, where there were contests in the arts, and a laurel wreath was awarded instead of the olive. Some people competed in both athletic and arts events, like the American Walter Winans, who won gold in shooting and in sculpture. Hungarian Alfred Ahos won 2 gold medals in swimming in 1896 and a silver in architecture at the Paris Olympics in 1924. Suspiciously, the founder of the IOC and champion of the modern Olympic Games, Pierre de Coubertin himself, won a gold medal for literature at the 1912 Summer Olympics for his poem Ode to Sport, under a pseudonym based on the names of villages close to his wife's place of birth, to deflect suspicion, no doubt. I've absolutely no intention of reading it. So I hope you didn't mind this new 5.5 Great Things format, which I'll likely continue in the near future. I'll have to think about what topic to choose next though. There's a lot of potential. 5.5 Great Things about certain countries, certain religions, oh there's a controversial one, certain people, historical, contemporary, TV shows, and so on. But next month I'll be continuing with the Muses series, this time Urania, Muse of Astronomy, because I've already recorded it. So please join me for that one.